I've been trying to catch myself up on everything that's happened since what sparked the war 10 years ago. And, there are, 10 years is a fairly long time for us mere mortals. There are a lot of players, a lot of, movement, changing of alliances, changing of territory. So I tried to simplify it into kind of, what triggered it and where we're at now. For the sake of the blog post, I have lots of other stuff to share as we discuss it afterwards. But yeah, so I'm going to get into reading it and then we can discuss it afterwards. A 4-minute primer on the war in Syria for the average American. Syria's been at war for over a decade. That may not seem like long since the US has been at war for about 240 years. But unlike most of our wars, Syria's is happening where they live. In 2011, uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt gave hope to pro-democracy activists in Syria. That March, 15 Syrian boys were detained and tortured for writing graffiti supporting the uprisings. One boy died. Peaceful protests ensued, and President Bashar al-Assad had protesters imprisoned and killed. Several opposing forces throughout the country got involved. Once the UN voiced its concern, many foreign actors joined in. In a nutshell, the Assad regime, supported by Hezbollah from Lebanon, Iran, and Russia, has retaken control of most of the country, except key land in the northeast, where the oil fields and croplands are. The Syrian Salvation Government, SSG, has formed with support from Al-Qaeda and HTS, which stands for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a merging of several former groups. They still have control of much of Idlib province. The Syrian Interim Government, SIG, formed as an alternative to the SSG. Turkey and Qatar provide support to this group. They control sections of Syria near the Turkish border where the NES doesn't occupy. The Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria, NES, aka Rojava, refers to Kurd-occupied land where most of Syria's oil fields and croplands are. These folks include the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, and supporters include the US, Russia, France, and several Kurdish organizations. Daesh, aka ISIL or ISIS, controls territory throughout Syria. Al-Qaeda was a supporter, though they claim to have broken ties. The US has a base in Tanif and controls most of the oil fields. Many US allies take part in what the US military calls Operation Inherent Resolve. And not least, there are the estimated 500,000 people killed, 2.1 plus million people injured, and 13 million people displaced. Why the major foreign participants are involved. The US, claiming they are trying to stop Daesh, support several groups, including Daesh. They're also trying to stop Iran and Hezbollah from establishing a presence that could threaten Israel. Russia wants Assad to retain power. They've sponsored peace talks, though the talks usually stall over the idea of removing Assad from power. Turkey has supported the non-Kurdish anti-Assad factions. They seek to keep Syrian Kurds from gaining more territory and autonomy. Iran and Hezbollah are supporters of the Assad regime. They are close allies with Syria and Iran has been providing oil for the Syrian government. Iran hopes to see a land corridor from Iran to Lebanon through Iraq and Syria. What all this means practically is 60% of the Syrian population is living in poverty. The estimated damages to the oil sector alone, about 25% of the economy, is $92 billion. This includes reduced exports, damage to infrastructure, environmental pollution, diseases from makeshift refineries, and more. Syria is now missing the education and support programs that money could have funded. And the food and clothing those crops could have produced now must be imported. There's only one border crossing left open through which aid is delivered. It's in Idlib, where al-Qaeda and allies have their stronghold. So that is my brief primer on the Syrian war. And I know for everyone who hasn't spent all week reading this, there's still some questions. So I found this map that kind of helps lay out the state of things as of March. So just the end of last month, March 23rd, 2021. And it's color coded. I have, this is the original legend, and I also have a more in-depth one that kind of breaks down what each of those labels mean. So the pink is the official Syrian government, the Assad regime. And so they have, you can see the spots that have like the horizontal lines. Those are parts that they've regained. Up here, and I'm assuming you can all see my my cursor. If you can't, let me know. But up all in this purple area, that's the northeast section, where the Kurds and their allies, like the SDF and all of them, that's where they're occupying. And that's actually also where most of the oil fields and the crops are. And so they've had to, the Assad government has had to make deals with them to try and get oil. But with like the U.S. backing them, and the U.S. has put all sorts of sanctions on Syria and others trying to help Syria, which makes, the assistance they've been getting, not that we have the authority to tell people what they can, like other countries, what they can and can't do. But, like Iran providing oil for the Syrian government, that's not only in spite of the sanctions on Syria, but we also have a ton of sanctions on Iran too. So I guess as long as we're here, I have so many, this is the video, okay. I have so many links because for any folks in the US who have tried Googling information about, I guess most foreign places in general, but specifically anywhere that, they don't necessarily want us knowing about, it's interesting to try and find good sources that provide all of the information. I have found, I'm going to share for anyone interested in not just Syria, but he covers, a lot of the Middle East. Richard Medhurst is a great source for this. I will warn you, he is not safe for work. But he is an investigative journalist, and he's Syrian and British, and, you know, he reports, he does interviews, you know, and a lot of the information, or at least a lot of the starting information I got from him. You know, he usually does, I mean, he'll do like long streams, but then sometimes he'll have like 15-minute videos available talking about one thing or another. So those are the places you can find him if you're interested in watching videos, and, you know, he'll tweet his commentary as well. Where are my notes? Okay, that's not even the first. So yeah, this is, if anyone has any specific questions, feel free to ask. I'm trying to figure, I wrote my notes in the order that I thought them in, rather than necessarily in any order that makes sense to read through. I will, you know, since this sounds a little strange to some people, I don't know if any of you all had seen, I feel like it was relatively recently, that either, oh, was it was it 2 years ago already? I felt like it was more recent. Jimmy Carter had mentioned that, you know, the U.S. is the most warlike nation in the history of the world. And this article, you know, goes through it, talks about what he was saying a little bit more in depth. But I just wanted to point out, excuse me, he had said that we'd been at peace for only 16 years. But the author here says, you know, if you count wars, military attacks, and military occupations, there have actually only been 5 years of peace in U.S. history. So I know, so I guess it's easy-ish to kind of dissociate from that, because it's not happening here. You know, it's like, oh, it's halfway across the world. But I mean, we're a very hostile country. So I did just want to point out that, because, you know, most people probably don't think of us as, you know, having been at war so much, except for perhaps the folks that have been sent overseas to actually be part of those wars. And so, yeah, so that's a link in the article. Oh yeah, it's, I don't know why I'm feeling so out of sorts on this. I apologize. So Al Jazeera had a pretty good article outlining, you know, exactly what it says, Syria's war explained from the beginning. So this is where they explain Arab Spring, which is those uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. And, you know, how the government had actually responded to what started off as peaceful protests with violence. Does this sound familiar? And, you know, it goes into more detail because, again, like I mentioned initially, that over the course of these 10 years, there's been a lot of, you know, groups merging, splitting, changing alliances, that kind of thing. So there's a lot more detail in here that I tried to, not that I tried to leave out, but I tried to make the article a little bit less confusing. So you kind of have an idea of what's going on without having to know, you know, wait, who's siding with who? When did they change? So yeah, and as far as this, you know, touches upon some of the other countries that are helping. But I believe this one, the second link that I share at the bottom of the article, and again, this will be published tomorrow morning. This goes in a little more in depth into the US, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, and, you know, kind of why they're even here. And I had this highlighted. I thought it doesn't want to load. So it just kind of goes more in depth on, you know, who each country is supporting, who they're fighting against. And actually, oh, I have a visual. For anyone who thinks a little more visually, rather than, you know, seeing it written out, you know, the lighter arrows are, you know, the groups that are supporting each other, and the darker arrows are showing who they're attacking. And it just, you know, to me, it looks kind of like a jumbled mess, which could be indicative of the complexity of this. But, you know, I tried to sort them all out and group them by the color coding that's on the map, to kind of, you know, place everyone. If for those of you, again, who think a little more visually. So with the Assad regime, you know, that includes Hezbollah supporters, Iran, and Russia. Iraq was supporting them for a short while, but that is no longer current. So that's, you know, in all of this. And this here, Damascus, is the capital. That's where the government is based out of. That's where, you know, ideally aid would be going to. But I mentioned that there was only one. Oh, that didn't get much bigger. There's currently only one border crossing open, and that's actually up here. So not quite near where they'd like it to be. And this brown spot in here, so that is actually where the SSG has their stronghold. Their supporters include Al-Qaeda, and I'm gonna pull my notes back up. Just want to make sure I'm getting as close as I can to the pronunciations. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS. So they're all there, but that's also, you know, in Idlib. This is Idlib city, and then this whole section here is Idlib province. And this is where most of the Syrians who, when they're displaced, but they stay in the country, this is where most of them are going. And another great portion, I mean, a lot of folks, I think, I know it's in one of the articles, I believe it's like 6.6 million folks have ended up in Turkey. And then, you know, some folks moved even further west into Europe. But the other number, I know the numbers are 6.6 million and 6.7 million. And off the top of my head, I can't remember which is, you know, the number of refugees in Turkey and the number in Idlib province. But yeah, so a lot of the folks who have been displaced and need aid are in this area. The yellow is, oops, wrong way. I've got too many tabs open, but that's nothing new. So the yellow is the Syrian interim government, which includes forces from Turkey and Qatar. And this is where, you know, things start get really confusing. with like, wait, you know, the US was supporting them for a bit. Saudi Arabia was, the UK, France, Libya, you know, and they've since moved on to support other groups. But it's all, you know, a lot, if not all, and I'm want to refrain from giving too much personal commentary, especially since I'm still kind of taking this all in. But a lot of the actions that I've read about, and just based on what I know about the US, you know, a lot of the foreign groups are, you know, after their own interests. So it's not necessarily a surprise to see like, oh, we're going to support these guys for a couple of years, and oh wait, they're going in a different direction. I'm going to come support these folks now. And, you know, even this is an oversimplification. There's a lot going on economically, religiously. There's so much history that I just, you know, I haven't dug deep into yet because, like I said, I was trying to kind of find out, okay, where are we now? So I'm sure there's more as I delve in, and I still have some links that I had found while doing my research that I didn't have the time to go into more. And I'll share all of this with you. If there's anything specific you want more information on now, let me know. And we can definitely talk or share links. But as usual, I'll provide all of my notes and everything in the Discord after, if not tonight, then tomorrow, because tomorrow is also when I publish the blog post. So these two yellow spots up here, that's where, you know, Turkey's kind of occupying. And, you know, again, the purple is where I keep saying the Kurds. There are Arabs there as well. But in the purple zones, that is, you know, there are a lot of Kurdish folks in there. It's the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF. We are up there because of, you know, that's where the oil fields are. And that is obviously our interest. And not even because Syria produces a lot of oil. They actually produce about, I think it's like 0.5% of the world's oil. But because ISIS was able to, you know, get their hands on it and make lots of money, and I do have sources for this. I actually think that, was it this one? So we actually control 90% of the oil in Syria because we're working with the SDF and those folks. And I don't know what happened to my highlights. I have this nifty little extension that supposedly lets me highlight stuff, but it's not working right now. So this also, you know, cites the $92 billion in direct and indirect losses. And this is not the article I was thinking of. Let me check my notes, because I will end up down a rabbit hole. Oh, my highlights are working here. So this is related. This isn't what I was looking for. I did read somewhere about how much, unless it could have been in one of the videos, about how much ISIS had made selling that oil. It was I want to say it was like millions. I can't remember now. But it helped, make them like the most well-funded terrorist organization in the world. So I did not write down the exact amount. I know it's in one of these articles, how much ISIS had made from selling oil, because they had previously had control of the oil fields. Again, this war's been going on for 10 years. There's been a lot of change in territory, which, I mean, if you Google it, you'll see. It took me a while to find this map, just because, when you Google it, the first ones that come up are like the ones that have gotten the most traffic, which tend to be older maps. But I was talking about the oil fields. Oh, so this article talks about an oil firm in the U.S. Going back to this, how we control 90% of the oil. We're working with the SDF and the Kurds who have control over this territory here. Not only that, but we have decided, despite the sanctions we have put on everyone else to try and keep them from, working with Syria as far as oil is concerned, the U.S. has, graciously allowed this U.S. oil firm to go in without having to worry about the sanctions, and, process this oil. And Trump was saying that, we're going to pull out and just stay for the oil, but we were kind of only there for the oil in the first place. And again, to keep it out of the hands of ISIS, because, I mean, the U.S. is still the top producer of oil in the world. And I realize I forgot to save the graph that I found. So this does mention, that oil provides about a quarter of the Syrian government's revenues. So so this mentions it's less than 0.5% that Syria provides in oil. $500 million. Here's the article. That oil earned at the peak about $500 million a year for ISIS, giving it the financial heft that no terrorist organization had ever had before. So obviously that caught other countries' attention. So then, ISIS was kind of, pushed back out of that territory. So the Kurdish forces and the SDF are who control that space now. And of course, the problem is they're not even necessarily working at full capacity. When was this? 2019. So again, things change, especially with, U.S. organizations coming in. They're probably, making improvements to the oil fields, but the war is still ongoing. There's still fighting, there's still airstrikes, there's still whatever types of combat they're using, and so there's still going to be damage in places. So they're not even producing as much oil as they were. So this describes that the oil fields are concentrated in two regions, one in the northeast and the other along the Euphrates River. So the northeast is this purple section that I've been pointing out. And then this here, you can see where the government and the SDF territory has kind of met here. This is the Euphrates River. So I don't know the nuance of, where precisely the oil fields are, and whether the government has been allowed control of them, if it's still, under that deal, where the SDF is kind of dictating how that goes. I am still unclear on that. I've got to close some of these tabs. What am I done with? We already talked about how small compared to other countries their output is. So these authors did come up with some ideas. These aren't necessarily true or official reasons. They were speculating that, we want to maintain control of the oil fields. So obviously, because we kind of, the U.S. is pretty zoned in on ISIS and doing what they can. They claim to be against ISIS, but then some of their actions end up, at least seeming to help ISIS. But that's, one idea is, we're still there because we don't want ISIS to regain control of the oil fields. Another reason they speculate is, to use it as a bargaining chip, as, whatever peace talks, settlements end up happening, if they can, whatever. I'm not sure. This doesn't talk about what they might use the oil fields as a bargaining chip for. And then they mention a third, to preserve these fields as an engine of recovery for the day when there's a post-Assad regime, which sounds a little idyllic to me. Again, kind of being a little familiar with the United States government and, their thoughts on recovery and preservation. I don't know that that's necessary. That might be what they tell us they're doing, but I don't have any faith that that's their real reason for doing what they're doing. But this article wraps up, calling attention to the fact that, like, the fate of the oil in Syria, kind of depends the fate of Syria and its people. Because it's such a 25% of the entire revenue of the government that's not small change. So it's like, all the stuff that we in the United States are like, oh, how come we don't have any money? Because it's all going to the military budget. Well, their money's just not there anymore. Because they don't have their oil fields, they don't have their crops. So this is, I just want to make sure, I don't want to close out if there's no link back. Oh, is this the one that's in the notes? Okay. And I think I keep kind of getting myself off track. I mentioned a new group of people and then go off on what they're up to. So this is one view. This is from Wikipedia, showing like who's kind of working together or, providing support and who is, attacking. So the darker lines show attacks, and then the arrows indicate, so the U.S. is attacking ISIS. ISIS is not necessarily attacking the U.S. I don't know. What are they doing? So these are the double-sided arrows, so you can see, okay, these are who ISIS is focused on. Yeah, so I feel like this, while laying out the relationships, also kind of shows, because my brain sees all of these lines and is like, no, that's too confusing. Even though once you like sit and look at it, it's not that confusing. And this is actually, so this is from March 2019. So 2 years ago, this is kind of the was the state of relationships with everyone in Syria. And I can tell you things have changed a bit, because this group here, which I did not look up, Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, I did not look up the pronunciation for that group. They're actually part of HTS now. So where am I looking? This group here. So where am I? Have I made it through? I've almost made it through. I promise I've almost made it through all of this. So all of the pink area here is where Assad's government, the Syrian government, has control of as of last month. The brown up here is where HTS and Al-Qaeda are. It's also relatively the same area where all of the Syrians who have been displaced but stayed within Syria, they're mostly in that area as well. The yellow is where the Turkish forces are. The purple is where the Kurds and SDF, which is the Syrian Democratic Forces, that's where they are. The purple up here is also where most of the oil fields and the crops are. There are some oil fields along in here, along the Euphrates River. This kind of grayish periwinkle, light blue color. So the U.S. actually has a base in Tanif, as well as, having the presence up here where the oil fields are as well. So this is kind of, I guess, where we're officially based. But it's also, we're calling it the Operation Inherent Resolve. And, that includes France, the UK, Jordan, Germany, Netherlands. I believe that's the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. And we can look at this. I got it from Wikipedia. As you can tell, I might have searched this a few times. The Netherlands, okay. UAE, yes. I read it through several times too, but wanted to make sure I was getting it right. So, there has been support from other countries as well, but as you can see, they've all kind of fallen off. Again, and that's more stuff that I didn't get into quite yet, as far as, what's changed for folks. I don't know if some of them, have better sense than the US or what, but sorry, that's personal commentary. So here's where the official base is. There are also opposition forces there that we're supporting, on top of, the folks up here. And then all of the white and gray, well, not just white, but all of the gray stripes, those indicate ISIS support zones. And where I got this from, and I've got to, I will screen share so you can see. So this is where I got that map from. And the only thing I changed was taking the numbers and then the two little airplanes off of it. Otherwise, I just copy pasted it and then moved the legend up. So this is the Syria situation report for, February to March from the Institute for the Study of War. And they actually go through and explain, that each number corresponds to a location on the map to show each of these events, which I will share. I do have the link to where this PDF is. So anyone interested can read it at their leisure. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But so I'm assuming, the ISIS support zones mean that there's some kind of presence there. So it's still, quite a bit throughout the country. And so, so anyone who is interested in reading this, at that website, so that will take you to the page specifically for this situation report. But if you explore the website, they have more information. This obviously, comes out, it looks monthly. And they have a lot more information, a lot more details on like the actual activity going on versus, me just kind of summarizing where we're at. But I did highlight a little. Let's see what I haven't covered already. The SDF and Assad regime both depend on their oil trade due to restrictive U.S. sanctions limiting oil exports to and from Syria. And those sanctions, so there's something that we call, I have that right here. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to get this prepared, and then I realize, but I'm also not all that good at speaking and doing things at the same time. So this is actually, and I think they're going to stop me. I think I've tried reading too many of these. Oh, maybe not. So there's kind of a sad story in here about a young boy. I won't get into it. I just bring it up because it does mention here in this section that I'm calling attention to, it does mention Mohammed, which is the boy. If you're interested in reading the whole thing, that's the link there. But there's something that the U.S. is calling the Caesar-Syria Civilian Protection Act, which basically says that, Syria can't import or export oil. So it's interesting that they're calling it the Civilian Protection Act, because that's, the whole oil situation is why, they're in poverty, they're, starving. The economy is in ruins. So I'm not sure, not sure which civilians are being protected by that act. Yeah, so, and there's not as much aid going in, even though there is still that one route open. Less aid is coming through because no one wants to be caught with these sanctions. I don't know. I did try. Is this the one? Yeah, there's, in multiple of the articles I found, there are links to like the actual official act. All is, my brain explodes every time I try to read government documents like this. I admit it wasn't a deep dive, because again, I was covering a lot in my research. I have not yet found a link to something that kind of explains, the act and, what the sanctions are in plain language. It is something I plan on continuing to look for. Because, like I said, generally speaking, it's, Syria can't import or export oil. I don't know the details on, what happens if they try. And I highlighted this just because a reminder that, they're going through the pandemic too. So not only are they in the midst of a war, but they're also, they're going through the aid that they need includes, the PPE and medical supplies that they can't get in the volumes they need. On top of, hospitals are also being damaged and, in all the warfare. This mentions the numbers. More than 500,000 have died, and 13 million people, which I don't know if I mentioned that part. That's more than half of the country's pre-war population. There were actually like 22 or 23 million people in Syria before the war started. So that's half the country has had to leave their homes. And I haven't laughed that much, but I'm not laughing because it's funny. I'm laughing because it's my coping mechanism. If you sit and think about it, this is huge. This is scary stuff. And, I, for some reason, feel more comfortable laughing at inappropriate times than crying at appropriate times. Anyway, this also mentions with the EU, who have their own sanctions as well, they're not interested in lifting those sanctions before the start of a political transition in the country. And again, there have been some peace talks. Turkey and Russia, I know, have sponsored some peace talks, but they tend to, come to a standstill because, some folks, coming back to the groups involved here. So, Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia want Assad to stay in power. And obviously not everyone shares that intention. And, it's something that I'm still struggling with. Like, I want so badly to be like, yeah, okay, these are the bad guys and these are the good guys. But, the Assad regime, has been, the whole thing started when, in peaceful protests, after, boys were detained and tortured, there were peaceful protests, and then he had the protesters in prison and killed. Like, that is not a good thing to do. But, at the same time, he's facing opposition from literal terrorist groups as well. And then, in other countries who are coming in just to serve their own interests. So, as much as I want there to like, oh, this is the good guy I want to root for, it's like, aside from, the civilians who would prefer just to live their lives, I'm sure, safe, fed, I can't say that, there's a clear-cut right direction. And again, I'm going to keep saying this, just in case anyone else is popping in. I'm by no means an expert. I realized a week ago today that I did not know nearly enough about Syria to even bring it up. So I've been doing research this past week, and just I wanted to try and keep it simple. At least, for the blog post, I feel like I kept it fairly simple. And then, like I said, I'll be sharing my notes, all the links that are in there. There's links throughout the post, and there's, my usual for later resources, including there are some videos. Again, I highly recommend Richard Medhurst. Not safe for work, but very straightforward. He does not mince words. And he helps kind of explain, because I'm sure other governments are like this too, but the US government is good about, like saying things that sound good, but when you break it down, you realize, oh, no, they're not, what they're talking about is not a good thing. And he helps point that out. Yeah, and I keep doing this. What was I just explaining before I went back to trying to keep it simple? Okay, so there was this. This we don't need anymore. That was me looking up what a word meant. So, oh yeah, this was about the sanctions. And yeah, this article about the Caesar sanctions goes on to say that, using sanctions isn't realistic. It goes on to list, Britain, France, and Germany have all renewed their sanctions rather than realize that they don't work. Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi, Castro, none of them were removed by sanctions. The Ayatollah in Iran has not been removed by sanctions. And the sanctions don't hurt the rulers, they don't hurt the people in power. They hurt the folks that aren't getting what they need. So yeah, this one is, did I share that one already? Yeah, this was the last link I shared, is this article about the sanctions. But yeah, content warning about the story about the young child, and also the author mentions a friend being found dead. All right. Okay, there was one last thing on this map that I did not mention, and that's the purple areas with the red lines. And that's just, those are still the SDF dominated areas, but there is the Assad regime a presence in those areas. Again, I took that at face value. I have not delved into that to know precisely if it's just like, oh, we'll allow you, people standing around looking like you're here, but you don't really have any power, like that kind of thing. So yeah, so that's a little bit more about all of the different folks involved, or at least, as of now. Like I said, there's been a lot of, a lot of smaller groups. There are a lot of smaller groups, but there have also been groups that have, kind of merged or changed alliances as time goes by. So this, going back to the Al Jazeera article explaining the war from the beginning, talks about how US and Russia got involved, and just different attacks. So I mentioned that there have been peace talks. It's been ongoing, but like I mentioned, the main sticking point is Assad himself and whether he gets to stay in power. So yeah, there were UN facilitated talks. They did, so they set up some de-escalation zones in 2017. Yeah, a lot of plans have, kind of fallen through. Yeah, and there are other links. It's easy to go down a rabbit hole of links. this also, so I touched upon the different rebel groups. I did not mention the Free Syrian Army. Those are actually, they were the Syrian National Army, the government's army, but they've defected. And it also includes civilians backed by the U.S., Turkey, and some other countries. So this says in December 2016, the Syrian army scored its biggest victory against the rebels when it recaptured the strategic city of Aleppo. Since then, the FSA has controlled limited areas in northwestern Syria. So if we come back up here, so there's Aleppo there. Yeah, so more about different attacks. ISIL, so again, that's ISIS, Daesh, different names for the same group of folks. But yeah, so they emerged, so in the north and east. So like I touched upon in one of those other articles, that they had originally had control of at least some of the oil fields. So obviously that is not the case anymore. But yeah, that goes back to the, what was it, $500 million a year they were making with the oil, but they've been pushed out of that area now. So I've talked about Hezbollah and the SDF. And this is that other group that I was talking about in the thing that I closed. But they're part of this group now. And the situation today. So yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing thing. They've entered their 11th year of civil war. Which, I mean, I know, some of the wars that the U.S. has been involved in have lasted as long or longer, but, we don't, as U.S. citizens, most of us don't have to even think about that because it's not happening, like, literally in our backyards, like Syrians have to deal with. So, yeah, and when... I'm going to check this because it says today. So this is from 2018. So as of 2018, this was where the situation was. And again, so you can even see here in this map how things have changed a little bit. Not, some of these are still similar, but some of these places, the light, it's a green if you can see the green. Like up in Idlib, north of Aleppo, over, in the very southwestern piece here. Back in 2018, those were areas that rebel forces had, but, has now been recovered by the Assad government. And then, the Kurdish forces kind of have a similar spot. Turkey has come in to these areas here. There's a small rebel presence here back in 2018 versus, it's still there, but then, the U.S. base was built there. So, there are definitely some changes. And, and until something's resolved, then obviously there's going to be more. So yeah, this talks about, again, in 2018, kind of what was happening there, what everyone was up to. And then the refugees. So yeah, as of 2018, and like I said, the numbers now are like 6.6 6 or 6.7 million. But this is saying 5.5 million refugees at, 3 years ago, there were 5.5. So in 3 years, there's been another, 1.2 million Syrians displaced out of the country. Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan are hosting most of the Syrian refugees. And then many of them attempt westward. And this says, explains what they are calling a refugee. Any person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country. Oh, I have this. I say I have a highlight here. Let's see what I felt I needed to say. So this is another one from 2019. Again, the earliest Google results are, of course, the articles that have more traffic, so they tend to be a little bit older. If I weren't on such a short, deadline, getting it done in a week, I definitely would have spent more time wading through pages. But I have found some great new sources that I was not aware of before this week. So hopefully future research will be a little bit easier. I had highlighted this because they mentioned, the U.S.'s role in Syria and in the greater Middle East has been destructive throughout this century. So, I mean, I'm sure many of us know, or at least suspect, that, our involvement in Syria is not the first time we've pulled this. The invasion and occupation of Iraq have left destruction and chaos. The illegal bombing of Libya and the brutal murder of its prime minister have created a failed state. The U.S.'s alliance with Saudi Arabia in the war against Yemen has resulted in mass murder and destruction. The ongoing conflicts with Iran through illegal unilateral coercive measures, sanctions, regime change attempts, threats of war, and military skirmishes have created more instability in the region. And the U.S.'s special relationship with Israel has allowed continued ethnic cleansing and land theft from the Palestinians and has been a tool for instability in the region. The never-ending war in Afghanistan continues to cause destruction as the U.S. remains, even though it has been defeated. And these authors, Kevin Zeiss and Margaret Flowers, go on to say that, that their illegal wars, it's cost the U.S. trillions of dollars, and what benefit have we gotten out of it? U.S. policy has not served any positive purposes, but has caused instability, conflict, and destruction. And I feel like I had another, I don't know. Did I already share it? Trying to remember if it was in my notes or if I put it into the... Huh. I thought I had a link. What was I just reading? Oh, what's this? So this one's a little bit more recent, at least, last April. What has Washington offered to Syrians other than terrorism and siege? Okay, So, they start off saying the U.S. officials continue to lie and mislead the U.S. public opinion to cover up the flagrant role of the USA in backing, financing, and arming terrorist organizations in Syria, mainly Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra. And Daesh, again, is what we call ISIS or ISIL. And al-Nusra is the former name of, I want to make sure I get this right, I believe it's the former name of one of the groups that that merged into HTS. Yeah, al-Nusra. So that's one of the groups that merged into HTS. So again, coming back to try to, ground it all for you. So that's the group that's in the same spot that's supporting the SSG. That's up here in Idlib province. This article, so this is handsoffsyria.org. I can actually so that's the link to what I'm reading now. So yeah, it's saying that those are the two major forms of terrorism throughout the war in Syria. And they talk about a lot of organized crime and corruption reporting, the DoD spending, all that. They mention a program launched by the CIA during the Obama administration, where hundreds of millions of dollars had reached the hands of the terrorists. Consequently, the program was halted in 2017 once details of it were exposed in the media. We have funded the terrorist organization known as the White Helmets with tens of millions of dollars. So they're saying they're linked to al-Nusra as well. The most recent financial support was several months ago, so a couple years ago, I guess at this point, as of this writing. In September 2016, we provided direct military support, launching strikes against a unit of the Syrian Arab Army. We've been occupying parts of the land it says northern Syria. This is the area, again, up where the oil fields are, that we're involved in. Is plundering oil and depriving the Syrian people of it. Defying international law, the U.S. president announced last December that his country has put oil in Syria under its control and is now able to do with it as it wishes. So, I mean, what right do we actually have to anything in Syria? But yeah, that was Trump saying that, we've got the oil, we can do with it what we want. So yeah, ironically, Washington describes all of the above mentioned as aiding the Syrian people. Again, remember, the sanctions, I closed that one already. The sanctions that they were calling the Civilian Protection Act. Because, we got to make it sound good, because if it doesn't sound good, they can't get the support they need to get the funding they need to keep being there. So they describe it as aiding the Syrian people, including the illegal siege imposed without the UN's approval, a siege that is exercised with the spirit of jungle law that deprives the Syrians their right to import energy carriers, food, and medicine. During the current period, and with the coronavirus pandemic outbreak, the U.S. and its Western allies continue to adhere to the policy of imposing sanctions against the Syrian people, taking a toll on its livelihood, instead of extending a helping hand to confront the deadly pandemic. But that's kind of on brand for the US, right? Yeah, and, you know, it mentions the destruction and sabotage of the infrastructure due to the actual warfare happening over the past decade. So that was that. That was the last link I shared. So yeah, again, you know, other than serving, and I keep saying there and it when referring to the US in this conversation. And right or wrong, in my mind, I'm separating myself because, yes, I am a US citizen. I am part of the US. But in Syria, this is the US government via their proxy, the US military. And I am not involved in either of those entities. So whether I'm wrong to disassociate from it or not, that's where I'm coming from in saying them for the US. Because I'm using US, I guess, as shorthand for the government and the military. Yeah, I mean, accountability and my part in the whole system is a whole other conversation. I'm not denying it. But yeah, just to explain why, you know, I'm saying they, because it's, you know, our government has sent the military to Syria to, you know, act in the government's best interest, the U.S. government's best interest, not in the U.S. citizens' best interest, not in the Syrians' best interest. So yeah, I suppose I've distanced myself from that mentally. So this was about the oil firm that the U.S. itself has so graciously allowed to sidestep the U.S. sanctions. I did want to mention, I don't think I brought this up. I mentioned it in the article that Iran has been providing oil for the Syrian government. And okay, I'm going to refer back to my notes. This is another video from Richard Medhurst. Again, I highly recommend him. He's on Rockfin, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. He could be on Facebook. I am not. He is not safe for work, but he's very straightforward and explains things quite clearly. And really helped me sort out some of the information I was trying to sort out in my head.